Hello and good evening, everyone. My name is Dakota Russell. I am the Executive Director of the Heart Mountain Wyoming Foundation, and it's my real pleasure tonight to welcome you to our panel discussion on Wyoming's Japanese American roots. As so many great ideas are, this panel was really born of questions that I got a lot of the time here at the Interpretive Center. Mostly questions related to families that lived here in Northwest Wyoming since the 1920s, 1930s. And yet the folks who came in and asked about these family histories, usually old classmates and the like, just really couldn't fathom the idea that they didn't arrive here with Heart Mountain, that there was Japanese American history in Wyoming before Heart Mountain. And so in an effort to answer this, I started researching and writing an article earlier this year about Japanese Americans in Northwestern Wyoming. And through it, I made this amazing network of contacts and really uncovered this wonderful and rich story of Japanese American life here in the Equality State. And one that isn't talked about in a lot of the West, is the contribution of Asian Americans and Japanese Americans specifically to the building of the Mountain West, not just on the West Coast, but here in the interior as well. And I think it's a story that is ripe to be further told. And so I have assembled an excellent panel of experts to talk to you this evening, most of them with personal connections to this history. First, I'd like to introduce Dan Lyons. And Dan is actually only native to Wyoming going back to the 1960s there. But once he moved to Wyoming, he became very interested in the Japanese Americans who had lived here before him and what their lives were like. While stationed at Warren Air Force Base, he became very interested in the railroad history of Cheyenne and also the history of the Japanese plot and Potter's Field at Lakeview Cemetery outside of Cheyenne there. Dan has a long history of researching especially military matters in Wyoming, and he's the author of Wyoming Girl Guards, the Forgotten Women's Militia. So it's a pleasure to have Dan here with us tonight to tell us a little more about the railroad history of Japanese Americans and how many of the first Japanese immigrants first came to Wyoming. Secondly, I want to welcome up Don Aoki. Don is a fourth-generation Californian. He has degrees in computer science from MIT and USC. And his grandparents were incarcerated at Poston, Tule Lake, and Santa Fe during World War II. Don is very involved in a number of humanitarian and social justice efforts, including the Poston Community Alliance, Defy Ventures, and Habitat for Humanity. But importantly for us tonight, Dan's family also has a history in the mining community of Rock Springs, Wyoming, which he's going to talk to us about a little bit later on. Next, I want to welcome Alan Ohashi. Alan is a Sansei, so a third-generation Japanese American, born in Cheyenne. His documentary, Beyond Heart Mountain, is going to be airing on Wyoming PBS in December, and his book of the same name will be released shortly thereafter. Both the documentary and the book are about Alan's experiences of growing up as a Japanese American in Cheyenne's Japanese American community, which is now nearly lost. But as he talks about in his book and his film, there is hope for revitalizing it for the future. And so we welcome both Alan's discussion of the Japanese American history of Cheyenne and his experiences personally growing up as a Sansei there. And finally, I want to bring aboard Ora Newlin. Ora Newlin is both a fourth-generation Wyomingite and fourth-generation Japanese American, Yonsei. She is an educator and speaker. She serves as the secretary of the Heart Mountain Wyoming Foundation Board and as a founding member of Suru for Solidarity, the Japanese American Advocacy Group. She's also an anthropologist and sociologist and is right now teaching the first ever, I believe, Asian American Studies course at the University of Wyoming. So Aura is going to be telling us about her family story all over the state, but in Riverston and Yellowstone specifically. And so all of that said, I'm going to waste no further time, and I'm going to turn it over to Dan to get us started.
Well, thank you, Dakota. Well, before there was ever a Heart Mountain Relocation Center, Japanese immigrants voluntarily came to Wyoming to work for the Union Pacific Railroad in the 1900s. They came here to seek their American dream of prosperity, but instead they faced prejudice and mounting challenges. In the next slide, I've identified three factors that contribute to the marginalization of the Japanese immigrant. The first factor is xenophobia. This is self-explanatory, so I don't really need to get into the details because it was obvious the Japanese immigrant did not blend in well with white Europeans because of their looks and language. Now, point number two is a little more interesting because organized labor in California originally welcomed Japanese immigrants to the labor market. There was such a positive response to them being in the workforce that in 1872, the California Immigration Board petitioned the state legislature for $30,000 to induce immigration. But by the end of the century, the Japanese fell out of favor and they were a hated commodity because they oversaturated the job market and they worked for coolie wages. And it was a perception that they took white man jobs. Now, the third point, newspapers, they really seized upon this rhetoric about the evils of Japanese labor, which led to bad publicity for the Japanese. Now, this was during the golden age of yellow journalism, so newspapers increased their circulation with bold and sensational headlines and articles that played loose with the facts. And because people believed what they read in the newspapers, the power of the press shaped public opinion, and unfortunately, this led to violence against the Japanese. Now, there were major riots on the West Coast, in the Pacific Northwest, and British Columbia, and in 1908, the violence even spilled into Wyoming. In Laramie, during a 3-day period, there was rioting where American boys vandalized Japanese business, stoned immigrants, and roped and dragged one Japanese man through the streets. Fortunately, no one was killed. Now, in slide 3, you're going to see a graphic of where the Japanese were distributed in Wyoming. Now, you can see, if you look over to the lower right-hand corner to Albany County, you can see that this riot in Laramie wasn't a fair fight. According to the 1900 census, there were 8,200 people living in Laramie and only 15 Japanese. Now, I'm not a math major, but that comes out to like 0.05% of the population of Wyoming. So now, in the lower right-hand graphic next to the Albany County, you'll notice that there was only one Japanese living in the Union Pacific's western headquarters in Cheyenne. Well, that number is low because the immigrants did not arrive in Japan in time to be enumerated on the census in 1900. Now, the main concentration of Japanese was at Evanston, which served as the eastern headquarters. The eastern headquarters, and in the mining district of Sweetwater. So why was it necessary to bring the Japanese to Wyoming? Well, in 1900, the Union Pacific double-tracked its lines in southern Wyoming as part of a $5 million infrastructure upgrade, and the Japanese played an important part of this. Now, that $5 million in today's money is equivalent to $162 million, and that's using the Consumer Inflation Index to determine that amount. Now, I'm just going to focus on the case for the Japanese labor on the railroad project in the eastern part of Wyoming. Now, one of the construction project was reducing the summit and you'll see that on the next slide, was reducing the summit at Sherman Hill. Now, Sherman Hill is the highest point on the Transcontinental Railroad, and the Union Pacific reduced the grade by 200 feet. To do this, they had to drill through solid granite, and Japanese laborers helped move more than 800,000 cubic yards of granite and dirt to fill embankments along the rail line and where the Union Pacific constructed and reconstructed bridges. Now, the Japanese were hired because there was a labor shortage, and there was always a labor shortage on the Union Pacific. And because they were employed in numbers and for entry-level wages, they were hated. Now, in the time remaining, I'm going to sum up the Union Pacific's vote of confidence in the Japanese labor. Bullet number 1, the Union Pacific had confidence in Japanese labor that at one time, almost 75% of all foremen on the line were Japanese. The Japanese worked well with their own countrymen, and they were able to supervise workers of the other nationalities. So this was certainly a vote of confidence for the Japanese labor. Now, a high majority of these Japanese spoke English, and those who spoke English taught the younger workers 3 words a day. So over time, these younger workers became proficient in the English language as well. And the final bullet, the Japanese understood their jobs and responsibilities because they translated the Union Pacific's professional development courses from English to Japanese. No other nationality did this. So it's for these reasons and more that Union Pacific controversially hired Japanese laborers in Wyoming. So if there are any questions, I can take them now, or should we wait till the end, Dakota?
Let's wait until the end, Dan, and let's go ahead and move onward to Don, and then we'll gather everybody up for questions at the end.
I'm a history buff. In the last 3 decades, I've been able to discover the untold narrative of my family's experiences in Wyoming at the turn of the last century. My friends know I have an eclectic range of interests, and I can be a storehouse of lots of useless information. I was the only person I knew with an interest in the history of the Union Pacific and the immigrant Japanese who worked for them over a century ago. Growing up in Los Angeles and living in suburban Chicago, Boston, and now the San Francisco Bay Area, I never met anybody who had roots in Wyoming, much less heard of Rock Springs. It was a chance encounter with Wyomingite Aura Newlin at a consortium in DC a few years ago that revealed our shared Wyoming ancestral roots. I met Dakota Russell at the same consortium and encouraged me to present my family's story to the Heart Mountain Foundation. I recently obliged with an article in their quarterly newsletter. I heard stories from older relatives about our immigrant forebears settling in Wyoming as coal miners and railroaders, but other than a handful of anecdotes, I knew nothing of their experiences, other than imagining a western frontier town with extreme weather. As far as American history was concerned, they didn't exist. That was no surprise, since conventional history may have exalted completion of the first transcontinental railroad in 1869, but rarely spotlighted the hardships of the 20,000 Chinese laborers who built it. The presence of Japanese laborers in the Rocky Mountains during this period was even less important in the historical narrative. As self-appointed family historian, I became compelled to learn more about our ancestors who came to Wyoming and how they lived. The following video relates their story. I hope you enjoy it.
"15 members of my family called Rock Springs, Wyoming home during the first 2 decades of the 20th century. Rock Springs was an Old West coal town full of saloons, a stop on the Transcontinental Railroad, and a haven for mountain men, miners, and outlaws, including sharpshooters like Calamity Jane and bank robbers like Butch Cassidy, who received his moniker as a Rock Springs butcher's apprentice. The Union Pacific Coal Company produced most of Wyoming's coal from mines in Sweetwater County around Rock Springs. After the Transcontinental Railroad was completed in 1869, thousands of Chinese laborers lost their jobs. Many flocked to towns like Rock Springs to work in the mines. As bachelors, the Chinese accepted living in large groups to save on rent, allowing them to live on lower wages. White miners attempted to unionize, but their strikes were repeatedly broken by Chinese who were willing to work for lower wages. In 1885, resentment and race prejudice erupted into mob violence, the Rock Springs Massacre. The white miners drove out Chinatown's 650 residents, burned it to the ground, killed 28, and wounded 15. In response, the Union Pacific recruited immigrant workers, expecting they would be less likely to organize into unions because of language and cultural barriers. In the 1910 census, Rock Springs had a remarkably diverse population. With fewer than 5,800 inhabitants, the town had attracted immigrants from 56 nations, as well as Union and Confederate Civil War veterans and formerly enslaved African Americans. The first Japanese arrived in 1892 to work on the Union Pacific Railroad and in the coal mines. By 1907, there were 383, including 6 women and 4 children. My relatives were among them. Many ethnic groups lived in their own enclaves. The Japanese lived in Jap Camp, where drinking, gambling, and prostitution ran rampant. A cinema showed Japanese movies. One former resident recalled knowing only 5 men who didn't gamble and 1 who didn't drink. The last residents left in 1964. My great-grandparents, Shichigoro and Shima Hirayama, arrived in 1904 with their daughter Harue, born on a Maui sugar plantation. Plantation overseers imposed harsh fines and whippings for talking, smoking, or pausing to stretch in the fields. The Hirayamas left Hawaii as plantation life was brutal. Shichigoro became a miner for the Union Pacific Coal Company. The work was dangerous and dirty, but preferable to plantation work. Off-duty, Shichigoro entertained the miners by reciting newspaper articles from memory and telling amusing stories. Many were illiterate, but Shichigoro could read and write, skills learned from monks at a Buddhist temple in the mountains of Fukuoka, where he swept floors as a child. Meanwhile, Shima prepared meals for the miners at a boarding house: rice, vegetables, and fish soup. When not cooking, Shima was having babies. By 1913, she had given birth to 5 daughters and a son. While Shichigoro and Shima were getting established, my future great-grandfather, Nikichi Hamada, arrived in Rock Springs, temporarily leaving his family in Japan to seek opportunities overseas. After a year in the Pacific Northwest, Nikichi joined a Union Pacific rail crew. It was a dangerous job, as falls and mishaps with heavy equipment were common. The track man, or crew leader, was usually the strongest man. One day, a loaded cart rolled down a hill, and the men needed to retrieve it. Teams of men failed, but Nikichi pulled the cart uphill by himself. There were frequent strength competitions. Nikichi was able to carry a rail segment the furthest and was the only man to pull a coal car by his teeth. Nikichi earned a promotion to trackman and a 2.5-cent increase to 43 cents per hour, equivalent to a 2021 hourly rate of $11. Nikichi's family joined him in September 1914 as World War I started. Nikichi's 37-year-old wife, Asa, brought their children, Hatsuki 17, Momoe 11, and Meiji 1. The Hamadas and Hirayamas became close friends, as families with children were uncommon. Hatsuki had completed high school in Japan, but enrolled at Rock Springs High School to learn English. He became known as John, graduating in 1918. John and Harue hit it off despite the 6-year age difference. Harue tutored John in English until she left in 1917 to complete her secondary education at a Methodist girls' school in Japan. After Harue's graduation, they married in 1922, eventually raising 9 children, including my mother, Jean. John worked as a Union Pacific paymaster, delivering payroll to the miners. The job was dangerous, as robbers continuously scrutinized bank visitors, knowing that the half-hour walk to the mining camps offered ample waylaying opportunities. One snowy day, John noticed a suspicious man shadowing him after retrieving payroll. He retraced his snowy steps and hid behind a large boulder. John observed his stalker brandishing a rifle, reaching the end of John's footprints and looking perplexed before withdrawing. John had avoided an ambush. On another occasion, as John approached the bank to retrieve payroll, a robber burst onto Front Street, clutching money bags. At that same moment, the sheriff was across the street, exiting a saloon. In a flash, the sheriff drew his 6-shooter and gunned the man down. Asa, not knowing English, communicated by pantomiming with the town grocers. When she wanted eggs, she would squat down, flap her arms wildly, cluck and mimic depositing an egg. Among children, she was a memorable storyteller, adept at telling Japanese ghost stories. In 1916, Nikichi's brother Gojiro arrived from Victoria, British Columbia. Tragically, his 21-year-old wife died in Canada 7 months earlier. Gojiro decided on restarting life as a coal miner and adopted the name Frank. Dapper and handsome, Gojiro was a ladies' man who loved to sing. As the second decade of the 20th century drew to a close, circumstances drove the Hamadas and the Hirayamas to leave Wyoming. In January 1917, Asa gave birth to a son, Hideo, during one of the coldest winters on record. Despite her efforts to keep him warm, Hideo died within 11 days. A year later, 5-year-old Meiji succumbed to diphtheria as the first cases of the global Spanish flu pandemic emerged. With the end of World War I, coal demand plunged. The pandemic sidelined workers and employment fell. rail jobs disappeared, and not wishing to be lifetime coal miners, weary of the extreme weather and disheartened by Meiji and Hideo's deaths, the Hamadas and the Hirayamas decided to leave Wyoming for California. They boarded the Union Pacific train for Sacramento, which offered temperate weather and the fourth largest Japanese population in the United States. Switching to farming, in 1937, John and Harue purchased a farm in Mayhew, east of Sacramento. They were successful truck farmers before the removal to the Poston concentration camp in 1942. During incarceration, they sold their farm for a 70% loss. Post-war, they settled in Los Angeles, never to return to farming. A century later, their descendants no longer call Wyoming home, but remember and cherish their struggles as 6 generations have flourished in their wake.
All right, thanks so much, Don. I want to welcome next Alan Ohashi to talk about Japanese American life in Cheyenne. Welcome, Alan, and you can go ahead and unmute whenever you're ready.
Thanks, Dakota. All the presentations have been very interesting and diverse. I'm going to talk a little bit about, I wrote a book and made a movie, and these few slides are just sort of the high points about more about the history of the Japanese neighborhood in Cheyenne. You can move on to the next slide. I've chosen to look at the history and with 2 perspectives. One is about historic preservation, and the other is about historic placemaking. And both of those are kind of technical terms, but historical preservation has to do with preservation of buildings and structure based on architectural significance of an area. And the historic preservation was the aspect that sort of was the inciting incident for me to be involved or get more involved in learning about the history of the Japanese community in Cheyenne. And as such, the other part is historic placemaking. And that's about sort of reimagining a community or reimagining a neighborhood based on the history and past cultural presence. And the idea there is there may not be a physical presence of buildings or people, but there are the stories that are linked to the neighborhood. And so my 2 projects are basically sort of a meld between historic preservation and historic placemaking. Can move on to the next one. As Dakota mentioned at the beginning, I'm a Cheyenne native. I was born there in 1953, and my sister came along 2 years after. And we were, kind of raised in the wake of World War II, and my parents wanted us to become, the model minorities and not make waves and really blend in. So we wouldn't have to be afflicted by the prejudice that they faced while they were in Cheyenne. This is a picture of my neighborhood, all the neighborhood kids. There's a guy across the street named Mr. St. Clair, and he always made arrangements for field trips for the neighborhood kids to go to various places around Cheyenne. And this was a field trip that a bunch of us took to the Plains Dairy in Cheyenne. And after the tour, we were all given popsicles. If you can move to the next. This was a slide that was going to be a newscast that I happened to catch on Cheyenne TV. that was my one of my high school classmates from East High School, and he and his brother and he and his family have a car dealership called Deneen Ford Mercury that's located in downtown Cheyenne. And they had purchased they had gotten out of the car business and were trying to redevelop and reposition the properties that used to be their car lots. And John was appearing before the City Historic Preservation Board asking for a demolition permit for a building at 509 West 17th Street. And turned out that that building was the last building standing in the Japanese neighborhood. The Historic Preservation Board decided, and was a good decision, that the building was, architecturally insignificant, even though it was the last building standing in the neighborhood, but it was cost prohibitive really to rehabilitate it and reuse the building. So the Deneens were allowed to demolish the building with the proviso that they provide a history of the neighborhood. And that's how I became involved. And this is a photo of, I guess, an image of a Facebook post that I made looking for information about the neighborhood. So I crowdsourced information and received a number of responses to my request about people who knew people in the neighborhood, also had businesses in the neighborhood, related to people who were in the neighborhood. And this is a photo of the Kubota family. And they are located in front of the pool hall there. That was a pool hall that they owned. Eventually sold it to my grandfather. And next to them is a cafe, which was the Highway Cafe. And so the Japanese community is generally the 400 and 500 block of West 17th Street in downtown Cheyenne. Can we move on? And just a short primer for those in video stream land. Just want to talk, we've been talking a little bit about some of the terminology. And the generational terminology, there are basically three terms that get utilized. One is Issei, and those are the first generation immigrants, generally from Japan. And you can see these are pictures of my grandparents. My grandparents, Ohashi, with the New Year's dinner in front of them. And he was came in, he had a pretty typical immigration into the United States. Both he and my grandmother entered from Washington State, from Japan. He was a farmer and very well known in agriculture in the Seattle, Tacoma area in Washington, won some awards for innovations in farming. And he eventually ended up in Wyoming via Colorado. He was given some advice about a lettuce operation in Colorado. And he hauled himself and his oldest kids to Colorado, to Monte Vista, and found out that the lettuce project wasn't as advertised. He was a little bit disappointed, but couldn't go back. Instead, he started up a truck farming business in Colorado, ended up in Cheyenne by way of Brighton, Colorado. And on the other side are my maternal grandparents, Sakata. My grandfather was a railroader. He worked for the Union Pacific originally in California. After he immigrated to the United States via Washington State. He worked in California for the railroad, and then eventually there was a downturn in the economy. That's why I was interested in picking Don's brain a little bit about railroad history. But anyway, there was a downturn in the economy around the early part of the 20th century. He went back to Japan and married my grandmother, who was there. He eventually got back on with the UP and worked and was transferred and decided to work in Wyoming because the economy was booming because of coal and a variety of things that Don had talked about also. Eventually, he ended up in Cheyenne after stints with the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy railroads, mostly in central Wyoming and west central Wyoming. My mom is the youngest there, sitting in my grandfather's lap, and her older sister Hisako and my Uncle George. They were all born in Thermopolis, Wyoming. He was a section foreman, and like Don was talking about, or I can't remember, maybe it was Dan was talking about Japanese maintaining their jobs during World War II. Well, my grandfather was was a section foreman who was not fired and was able to continue to keep his job. And he always said it was just because he had made strong relationships with his bosses and with the other guys who were on the line. He mostly worked with Latinos. In fact, my mom befriended many of my grandfather's employees' kids, and so she would go over to their house and learned how to make flour tortillas from scratch. And in my view, one of man's worst inventions as the Industrial Revolution came forward was pre-made corn tortilla or flour tortillas that came in plastic bags. After those came out, we never had. She quit making flour tortillas for us. All right, next we can go on to the next slide. This is the Nisei generation. Those would be my parents, and Nisei were Japanese who were born in the United States. These are my parents, Frank and Sumiko. They met at some sort of community picnic at Hines Lodge, which is a place east of Cheyenne. My dad worked 40 years for the Coca-Cola bottling company in Cheyenne and Laramie. My mom was a homemaker and stay-at-home mom. And eventually, when they moved to Laramie in 1973, she went back to work and retired from the University of Wyoming and embarked on a fairly successful art career. She was a well-known watercolorist in southeast Wyoming. All right, let's move on to the next one. And my generation are Sansei. I think all the people who are on the slideshow were on the panel today are Sansei. That's their generation. I was born in Cheyenne, as I mentioned. That's my sister Lorinda and myself. All right, so let's move on to the next. So I'll go a little bit through the geography of the Japanese neighborhood on West 17th Street. And it generally extended from Pioneer to Cary on the up and down streets between us. Well, and those would be the 400 and 500 blocks of 17th Street. And these are pictures of downtown Cheyenne looking up and down 17th Street from Pioneer and Cary. Let's go on to the next slide. One of the first businesses in the community was the rooming house at 509 West 17th Street, which was the subject of the City of Cheyenne Historic Preservation Board hearing. And its most notorious use at the end of its life was as an adult strip club bookstore. And the owners, John Deneen, he gave me a tour of the place, and here was evidence of some of the activity that went in there. There were these booths that you had to stay behind when you watched women dance in the back. There was a marijuana grow room in the back and a safe buried in the floor. It must have been quite the place, and that was in business through the 1980s. It was originally, though, not owned, but there was originally a boarding house there that was operated by Mrs. Yoshio Shuto. And she was very prominent in Cheyenne Japanese history. She came to Cheyenne by way of Nebraska and set up this boarding house. She was very entrepreneurial and was quite the cook and prepared great meals for her boarders in the boarding house. So let's move on. Next to the City Cafe, actually the boarding house was right across the street from the City Cafe, and right across from there also, I showed the picture before, which was the pool hall that was first owned by the Hosokawas at 516, and the Kubota family bought it from the Hosokawas. They sold it to my grandfather, who is pictured there queuing up the 8-ball. I mentioned that he immigrated to Japan and lived in Washington and ultimately Ketchikan, Alaska. And I think he was some kind of like petty criminal. I think he was, puzzle pool and did odd jobs and eventually ended up in Washington State in agriculture. That pool hall wasn't really allowed in there when I was young. I would occasionally get to go around with my dad when he went around to restock all the Coke machines. In fact, you can kind of see a Coke machine on the side there by the jukebox. And I always had to kind of stand outside and wait so I wouldn't be exposed to the scarlet women who would be frequenting pool halls in our community. All right, let's go to the next picture. This is the City Cafe, which is right next to the pool hall. And this is Mrs. Shuto's nephew, Tommy Shuto. And he came over when his aunt had to go back to Japan for health reasons and for other family reasons. And she got sick over there and never came back. The City Cafe was quite the gathering place for the Japanese community. It was kind of like reverse discrimination or reverse segregation, because all the Japanese preferred to sit in the front of the place, and all the white people like to wander through the kitchen like the Sopranos, I guess, and go eat at the big tables in the back. And it was kind of Americanized Japanese food with like chow mein, egg foo young, pork noodles, teriyaki steak. So Tommy Shuto had that sort of Western flair on Japanese food. There wasn't sushi, there wasn't ramen, there wasn't those kinds of food. There was just Japanese comfort food. And there's only one place I've ever found that was similar to that, and it was the 20th Street Cafe in Denver, right across from the Buddhist temple, and they went out of business because of COVID. And as the Japanese community declined, the City Cafe was they held on until maybe the early 1970s, and went through several iterations and ended up moving to another location a couple blocks away. And you can see down there, it's now still in business. It's a Pan-Asian restaurant called the Dynasty. And actually, I've never been in there. Let's go on to the next slide. As I mentioned, the City Cafe was kind of the gathering place for Japanese. And back then, there was an organization that was called the Skyline Nisei Club. And there's a black binder that has the notes from the club. And that's a newspaper clip of the club's first president, who was Hank Omoto. He was a mechanic down at the Halliday Garage and quite personable guy. He was the first president and served for a number of years. How I knew him, my grandparents, my grandmother worked at the City Cafe, and afterwards she quit there and started up her own cafe, which was a similar cuisine, but on the South Greeley Highway in Cheyenne, called the Highway Cafe. And Hank would come in and sit at the end of the counter, and every now and again he would bring in one of these fish, and my grandmother would throw it on the grill and cook him up one of his trouts. He was a good fishing buddy of my Uncle Rich, who also was a trophy fisherman. But anyway, more generally, the Japanese community met there for various activities on Friday nights. They had the Skyline Nisei sponsored the samurai movie night in the front. So all the women and the kids were up there watching silent movies, and in the back, there were private card games and screaming and yelling and lots of scotch being consumed. And I don't know if there's a card game called Hana, which is like gin rummy, but only with these hard cardboard cards that have pictures of flowers on them, and they would be. It's a very animated game, and you would hear these cards smacking down on the table with with a clap when people would get their proper runs of cards. So I've watched many a samurai movie there at the City Cafe. Let's go on to the next slide. One of the more prominent activities that happened in downtown Cheyenne was when a panel of Japanese judges came to town in November 1950. In the meanwhile, the Skyline Nisei Club had acquired a property which was nearby the City Cafe, and this was all the Issei and Nisei who were in town, and they entertained the judicial representatives from Japan at this dinner, and it was sponsored by a guy named George Guy, and he was a local attorney, and he had the distinction of being the defense attorney for General Yamashita, who was tried for war crimes after World War II. I think from what I've read, George Guy put up a very good defense for his client, but nonetheless, politics got in the way, and he was found guilty and hanged. All right, so what's next? Another business in the neighborhood was the Californian Fish Market that was at 422 West 17th Street. And it was originally owned by a family called the Matsuyamas. They owned it for about 20 years, and they sold it to my shirt-tail uncle and aunt, the Kishiyamas. The reason I say that is their daughter, Jean, married my uncle, Jake, and he had a very successful printing business called Pioneer Printing in Cheyenne. And they had and the Kishiyamas had a big presence, long presence down in downtown Cheyenne after they got rid of the fish market. Next slide. Another business in downtown Cheyenne was a bar called Baker's Place. And this was owned by the Tom and Bill Miyamoto and their business partner, who was this black guy named Johnny Baker. And it was supposedly the only segregated bar in Cheyenne at the time, and was frequented by the likes of Sammy Davis Jr. And you can go down to the next slide. And there's a picture of Sammy Davis Jr. talking to Richard By on a talk show, where he talks fondly about his time in basic training in Cheyenne, where he got close to his drill sergeant, who basically taught him how to read. And so he attributes much of his professional success to his time in Cheyenne, even though there was high levels of racial prejudice towards him shown, and he found solace at Baker's Place. And Baker's Place also had a number of iterations, starting before Prohibition, and then during Prohibition it was called Baker's Soda, and it was called Baker's Place, and then it wasn't until after Prohibition in 1932, I think maybe in Wyoming it didn't end until 1935, that it became known as Baker's Bar. And next, the Japanese community, as well as several other businesses in downtown Cheyenne, were ahead of their time. It was very common to live above the businesses where you worked. And this is a picture of young Steve Miyamoto in the apartment above Baker's Place, and how a snake got onto the top floor of their apartment, I'll never know. Let's go on to the next slide. We can go see if we can check out a couple other businesses that were downtown. There was a barber shop, and there was a market. The barber shop was owned by a fellow by the name of Takamatsu Matsushima, and it was a pretty strong business. And then next to that was a marketplace that was owned by Katsuma and Ume Mikawa, and they supposedly made tofu and supplied tofu for the Japanese community there. Let's go on to the next picture. Cheyenne also was the site of some Japanese activism during World War II. My aunt was an activist in town. She worked for the base chaplain at Fort Warren during the war, and she and the Japanese community organized a big party on happened to be on December 7th, 1941. That evening, they arranged for lots of fancy Japanese food to be made, and a record player to be brought in, and then it would happen to be the day that Pearl Harbor was bombed. And so no one really was much into the theme of the night and weren't really ready to party on. And so the party broke up early, and everyone went back and listened to FDR's speech the next morning declaring war on Japan. Anyway, my aunt worked with the Japanese community and local law enforcement and the newspaper and the radio station, and came up with this loyalty oath, and was signed by a number of Japanese. I think my grandmother's on there, and my aunt, and various other of my relatives signed this Japanese loyalty oath that was published in the local newspapers. Let's see here. What else do I have? Okay, well, this is another picture here. This is the Tulare Detention Center in the Central Valley of California. This is kind of out of sequence, but while my family and all the Japanese in Cheyenne were not subject to being sent to camp, they my grandfather and uncle were sent to Tulare. They happened to be in California sourcing vegetables and in the wrong place at the wrong time. And my aunt, who also was other aunt, Elsie, who was an activist, was able to get them released after several months, and they were able to come back. Additionally, there are a number of 442nd veterans, including my uncle, who lived in Cheyenne at the time. But Cheyenne also was the federal courthouse in Cheyenne also was a venue for a trial of the Heart Mountain Fair Play Committee. There were, I think I have down here 85 men who were convicted of draft evasion and all sent to federal prison, and they were pardoned after World War II was over by President Truman. So that's all I have. Thanks for paying attention. I hope you're paying attention.
All right. It looks like I'm up. There we go. So, hi, everyone. Again, my name is Ara Newlin. I will correct Alan that of our panelists tonight, I am not Sansei. I'm Yonsei, which is fourth generation. So I'm really glad that Alan gave us the definitions of the generations and how we speak about the generations in the Japanese American community. So I'm Yonsei. Was born and raised in Riverton, Wyoming, which is in the center of the state. But as Don mentioned, I also have really deep roots in the early Japanese American history in Wyoming. So I love coming after the presentations that you've heard already tonight, because they give so much context for the stories of my own family, and it actually helps me understand my own family's history a lot better. So this is a picture of my grandma and grandpa. They were Nisei, second generation Japanese Americans, and both of their parents, the parents on my grandpa's side and my grandma's side, were among those early immigrants from Japan to Wyoming. And so there they are with their Wyoming football helmet, showing their Wyoming pride. I'll start by sharing a few stories from my grandpa's side and then go to my grandma's side. So Grandpa George, his parents, his father and his uncles came to southern Wyoming. So they were around Superior, Rock Springs, Green River area. And they were, the uncles were in the coal mining business. Actually, they were, I think, some of the managers of the Superior coal mine very early on. My grandfather's father, my great-grandfather, started off in the coal mines, but then, as far as we can tell, he quickly moved into the laundry business. Can you go to the next slide, please? So he started into the laundry business, and one of his early ventures was actually in Yellowstone National Park. I'm not sure exactly when he was there, but I think it was maybe around 1915, 1916. And here's a picture of his laundry tent that he set up in Yellowstone National Park, like right around Old Faithful, which is, you know, they would never allow that now. But he was, you know, he'd heard about the tourist trade and thought all those tourists need their laundry done, those fancy tourists. So he went up and spent a summer catering to tourists' laundry in Yellowstone, which is pretty amazing. And I love that we have a picture of him in his tent. I think that's probably him in the middle with his dog. Next slide, please. And here's another picture of him back in Superior, Wyoming, back in southern Wyoming after that summer in Yellowstone with the same dog there. But this is a picture of his wedding ceremony. So his wife Toku came over from Japan, married in Seattle, and then they had this wedding celebration in Superior. And even here you can see that there are a lot of Japanese American faces in the picture, but also some white faces. And I think Dan was talking about how the press and newspapers were really antagonistic toward a lot of the Asian immigrants at the time, which makes me very pleased to share with you this wedding announcement in the Rock Springs Rocket newspaper, not actually for this wedding, but for the wedding of my great-grandpa's older brother back in 1908. This was from the Rock Springs Rocket in 1908. I'm just going to read it to you. My sister, who's actually writing a book about our family history, dug up this wedding announcement, and it's so fabulous that I just have to read it. So it says, Mr. C.N. Tsunada, that's my great-grandfather's older brother, who is proprietor of the Japanese store and boarding house at Superior, and who left for Seattle about 3 weeks ago, arrived in Rock Springs this morning in a considerably happier mood than upon leaving. On the 15th of June, Mr. Tsunada was married at Seattle to Miss Sawa Tsunada, who had just arrived from Tokyo. And this is what accounts for his glad smile. Mr. Tsunada has a flourishing business at Superior and readily makes friends with those whom he comes into contact with. Although we know little of the bride, we dare say Mr. Tsunada has chosen a worthy one and join in wishing them happiness and continued success. So other than that being kind of a hilarious wedding announcement, I find it really heartening that would have been written by a white journalist. And so even back as far as 1908, that a white journalist would report on this wedding of a Japanese immigrant in such kind of loving and friendly terms was really wonderful. Next slide, please. So this is the Tsunada family in Green River, Wyoming in 1922, where the laundry business has now been formalized. This is Green River Hand Laundry and Dry Cleaning. And the little guy on the tricycle on the bottom left is my grandpa, George Tsunada. So I'll switch now to the other side of the family and just give you a very quick snapshot, because their story is similar in a lot of ways and different in a lot of ways to the other side. So next slide, please. This is my grandmother's side of the family, the Matsumura side of the family, with Rokuzaimon coming over in 1906, straight to Wyoming again to work on the railroad. And she came over to be married in 1915. Next slide, please. And so they had their family. He was a section foreman on the railroad. And so they moved along the tracks all across southern Wyoming and into northern Utah as well. But a lot of the children in that family, my grandmother's siblings, a lot of them grew up in Granger, Wyoming. And here's a picture in 1933. And I share this because especially the railroading community of Japanese Americans, it must have been relatively tight knit, which is why I can bump into Don Aoki at a meeting and we can both be like, what? My relatives were railroaders in Wyoming too. And I'm sure that they knew each other. They must have known each other. They were here at the same time in the same area. And I have another connection here with my friend Stacy Kageyama, the Kumagai family and Kageyama family. I think both families were in Wyoming as well. And we sort of discovered each other online. And the more we got to talking, we realized that my great-grandmother had delivered Stacy's mother. My great-grandmother was a midwife. Her husband was a railroader and she was a midwife. And it turns out she delivered Stacy's mother. And this is a picture that Stacy had of her mother, her aunt, and her grandmother on the left, and my great-grandmother and my great-aunt Bunny on the right. So it's just amazing to discover these connections and then find photographic evidence of, their friendship at the time. Next slide, please. So the Matsumura family actually left Wyoming before the war, not long before the war. I think in the late 30s, my great-grandfather retired from the railroad and moved the family to Hollywood, California. And here you can see the picture of their market, which he called the Wyoming Market in Hollywood. And ironies of all ironies, when Pearl Harbor was bombed, the family was actually sent back to Wyoming. So they were forcibly removed and sent to Heart Mountain. Next slide, please. So here's a picture of the Matsumura family in front of their barrack in northern Wyoming, after having spent their whole lives in the United States, pretty much in Wyoming in a different part of the state. So although I'm sure it was a devastating time for them, as it was for most everybody who was forcibly removed, I like to think that there must have been a little bit of comfort to them knowing that they were coming back to Wyoming. Next slide, please. In the meantime, the Tsunada family was still in Wyoming, and a couple of others before me had mentioned that all of the Japanese American workers and Japanese immigrant workers were fired from the railroad. This is a headline from the Rock Springs Rocket in 1942. And so it's amazing that Alan's father, I think you said, Alan, your father was not fired. So there are so many interesting stories to share and to learn about. How was it that he made it through and the others were fired? Amazing. Next slide, please. So years later, my grandmother and grandfather eventually met right at the beginning of the war, actually, and got married right before my grandfather went off to Europe to serve in the 442nd. My grandma spent the war years in Rock Springs or Green River, I think. And then they ended up settling in Logan, Utah. But my mom was raised in Utah along with her siblings, but then she and my dad moved back to Wyoming and have spent the rest of their lives in Wyoming. And my siblings and I were all raised in Riverton. So that's why we have this continuity of, Wyoming history in our family. And my grandmother she was a photojournalist and also a bit of a lay historian. And she just took it upon herself, very much like Dan and Don and Alan, to study the history of Japanese Americans in the state. So she went around to gravestones that had Japanese writing on them. And she said, most every headstone had a story, and she researched whatever she could about the people who were buried in these Japanese graveyards. This is in Rock Springs, Wyoming, photo courtesy of my friend Stacy Kageyama. And if Kimiko or someone can put in the chat a link to my grandma's collection. She donated her collection to Utah State University, the Susan Sonata collection. And there's a link that I think is being put into the comments where you can access all of what she found about these Japanese pioneers. And in part because of that work, I learned that she was honored with a Lifetime Achievement Award from the National Association of Asian American Studies, which I didn't even know about until after she had passed away. So way to go, Grandma. And then the next slide and final slide, please. So this is a sign that I always share when I talk about my Japanese American roots in Wyoming. My grandfather painted this sign. He was an artist by trade. We're not foreign, we're from Wyoming. And I usually have shown this as a way of saying, like, look, we've been here for a long time. We can lay claim to, you know, being Wyomingites through and through. I have an asterisk now by the, when I talk about us being from Wyoming from so long ago, because it's always important to remember that we were also here on indigenous land. So the Chinese who came here to help build the railroads, and then the Japanese immigrants who followed, coal mining, railroading, we were all here on land that had been taken from indigenous peoples who had been here prior. And in fact, the history of the railroad is a history that involved, you know, decimating the buffalo population. So I always now want to make a point of acknowledging that these histories overlap in interesting ways, and discrimination sort of flows through indigenous stories and Asian immigrant and Asian American stories in complicated ways. And if someone can put in the chat the link to a article by actually an amazing author named Gilbert King, who I happened to meet at a conference a few years ago. So this is an article in the Smithsonian Magazine called Where the Buffalo No Longer Roamed, and it talks about the building of the railroad, immigrant work on the railroad, and indigenous intersections there. So with that, I will wrap it up. I know we're a little bit past time, but that's what I've got.
I think we have time for just a few audience questions before we have to go. So thanks for bringing us all back up. And I want to thank you all once again. These are some really powerful stories. And, you know, I definitely learned some things that I did not know about. So if you do have questions, please feel free to leave them in the chat on YouTube and they'll get to us here. But definitely write them quick because we've got some limited time here. First question from Paula Fujiwara, and this was directed toward Alan, but I'll ask everyone to chime in. And then I have a follow-up to it as well. So she was asking if any of you are part of the organization Asian American and Pacific Islanders in Historic Preservation. And my follow-up would be to that, because I know that organization is very active on the West Coast, very active in Hawaii, and not as active in the Mountain West. You know, where there aren't big organizations, where there aren't large communities in places like Wyoming to help preserve minority history and underrepresented history, what can folks out there do to make sure that their stories remain? And Alan, I'll open it up with you and then open it up to everyone else.
Well, I think we have found this little core of people who have more in common with one another than we ever imagined. And probably if we sat down and visited for about 5 minutes each, you know, the typical Wyoming thing, we will all have lots more in common than what we previously thought. And so I, for one, and it sounds to me like everyone in this group is somehow involved in the history of Japanese or history generally, and pertinent history. And I, for one, you know, I'm wanting to hear stories. I'm wanting to hear what your Wyoming connections are, and whatever they might be. Because seeing those pictures of Rock Springs of the Japanese community, those are, you know, I look, and I couldn't find anything when I was trying to find illustrations about Japanese in Rock Springs. And it's all boxed up in people's attics. It's all boxed up in people's basements. It's stuck in scrapbooks and long lost dead relatives' bureaus. And so it's a matter of all of us digging down deep into our personal archives and finding this stuff. And it's not just Japanese. I mean, you talk about all the other communities in the state too, the Jewish community and the Latino communities, all the African American communities, all very rich histories, but only there isn't that repository of information like you would find in LA, for example.
Excellent. Thanks, Alan. Would anybody else like to chime in on that? Don, I believe you're still muted.
Sure. What sparked my interest in this history was when my mother was diagnosed with terminal cancer 32 years ago. And I realized the stories she told me when I was little, the ones that I was disinterested in, suddenly took on heightened importance, that these stories were going to die with her. So I started interviewing her, recording her answers, started talking to her 8 siblings and other older relatives that were still alive. And this is in pre-internet days, of course. I then made myself over to the National Archives and I started looking a bunch of stuff up and accumulated a whole bunch of notes, found a bunch of photos in the family that were gathering dust and being ignored. And I realized, hey, if no one else is going to do this, I need to do it because it's going to be lost forever. And I thought the stories were just fascinating. So I took it upon myself a good 30 years ago to go down this road of recording these stories. And I think that's true for everybody, regardless of your ethnic background or what your family history might be, or whether there might be some skeletons in the closet. Younger generations have a curiosity about what life was like for people that lived in earlier times. And so this is something that's kind of a legacy I want to pass on to my kids and my extended family.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Don. So we had another question coming in from Haruka Sakaguchi. And the question was, for Alan, how was Tommy Shuto's City Cafe seating arrangement received by the wider Cheyenne community?
Well, the West Cheyenne is one of those parts of town where, you had to know about it, or you had to not be scared of it to go over there, because it just wasn't the Japanese. It was that on the west side where all the kids who went to Central High School went to McCormick High School, and that was the diverse school in town, west side. And so it was a matter of already being kind of socialized about that. And so the people who went from the white society or the white culture, they often had businesses that were downtown. And because it was kind of that reverse segregation I mentioned, is that they would come in large parties for lunch or an office party for a holiday, and so the only place where they could be seated and all together would be around those big tables in the back room. And there was one room that was a separate room where they played the Hanafuda game and drank Scotch whiskey, and that was also a room that the old ladies went in and made mochi, and they had figured out a way, because it was a restaurant, so they had figured out a way to make mochi using a sausage making machine. So they would load in the hot rice, and then it would then grind it through, and it would come, rather than putting it into sheaths for sausages, it would just come out in these long pieces of mochi sausage. And so it was also a gathering place for that kind of activity as well when the restaurant wasn't open.
So let me follow up with this, Alan, and then I'll ask Deanna also to comment on this from a labor perspective with the railroad as well. Is one of the things that you referenced in your presentation was the Denver's 5 Points neighborhood and the cafe down there, and the 5 Points is really interesting because it had such an integration of Black and Japanese American residents that really lived together and worked together and celebrated and were a community together. And do you feel like that existed within Cheyenne, where there was, a much smaller minority population, and even the minorities within the minorities were much smaller, And then,
and particularly West Cheyenne. That's my dad's family grew up over there. His childhood home was right across the street from some of those boarding houses that were listed in the Green Book for safe places for African Americans could stay. And so that part of town particularly was more diverse. But then my parents, we lived kind of on the gateway to the south side, just kind of in a quasi redlined area. And the school district changed the boundaries for my school. And so if I would have had to go to what my mom considered to be one of the rougher schools, Alta Vista School at the time, was kind of an urban school. And so they actually moved us to stay in the same school district. And so my family ended up being living in the suburbs. And so there was that picture of the kids in front of the Plains Dairy. Was my sister, me, Billy Sheba, Bobby Sheba, and that was it out of the whole Cole subdivision. And so that was the express purpose, for us to not have to grow up on the west side and with Latino kids and with Black kids. We were specifically moved so we would have this sort of middle class suburban lifestyle, and I regret that at one level, and so now here I am at the end of my life, basically, and trying to figure out how to undo all that and raise more awareness around issues of assimilation.
Dan, let me ask you to chime in on that again from a labor perspective, thinking about the railroads. There aren't generally you would generally have Chinese immigrant crews and so forth. There's not necessarily enough Japanese immigrants to form a whole crew. Did minorities kind of band together within the crews?
They did if you were a particular nationality. They kind of congregate with people that have similarities to them. I would say probably the only nationality relationships were probably the Greeks and the Japanese. They seem to have a very cordial relationship with each other. And I do want to make a comment about something that Alan said. Historically, the west side of Cheyenne has been a seedy area. I mean, you had the red light district, and it was a very diverse neighborhood. And I actually grew up on the west side, and I went to school with many different nationalities, and I didn't understand what prejudice was until I got into high school. We were at a track meet we passed through Lutz, Wyoming, and everyone's staring at the blacks on our team, and it's like, what's going on here? So growing up on the west side, it was more community centric.
Excellent.
And here's
Thanks,
something
Ed.
really interesting. The Japanese community, there was an actual Japanese community on railroad property, but if you look at any of the maps or records, there's no proof that it ever existed.
Where was that? Was that on 15th Street?
No, you're talking about 10th Street, 11th Street, and 12th Street.
Oh, that was right where I lived.
12 on 12th Street? You lived on 10th, right? East or west?
I was on 10th Street, yeah.
Okay, east or west is central. I'll have to get together with you and show you the map.
Interesting. You should mention the Japanese Greek connection, because in the Cole edition, with that that eventually ended up being a Greek and Japanese neighborhood. All my neighbors were Greeks, and there were the Kubotas, who I talked about. They moved just up the street, and there were a couple other Japanese families that moved in amidst the sort of Greek migration into the neighborhood, which was kind of made our neighborhood kind of weird.
Right, and I had Greek neighbors as well.
So, Aura, I wanted to ask you a question. Well, we've still got a little bit of time here that I think Alan and Dan kind of set us up for really nicely here, which I imagine that a lot of our viewers from other parts of the country, in particular in the West Coast, where there's, larger Asian American communities, wonder about is, what's it like being Japanese American in Wyoming in 2021? We are still a state that is 92% white, less than 1% Asian American. Do you feel highly visible? What's it like for you? And do you feel like you face discrimination? Do you feel part of the community?
It's an interesting question because I feel like it's shifting for me as I tap into questions of identity more and more and really embrace. I've always embraced my mixed race identity. So my dad is Irish and my mom of Irish heritage, and my mom is of Japanese heritage. And I have two siblings. I'm the youngest. I have an older brother and sister. And of the three of us, I'm the tallest one and the lightest one. So I'm definitely white passing. And I get people telling me all the time when I bring up my Japanese American heritage, inevitably, actually, from white people and Japanese people, they'll always say, "You don't look Japanese at all." And that's what I've got my whole life. Like, look how blonde you are. Look how tall you are. And so I kind of took that on and assumed that, like, I was kind of white. But I have since learned that that's, not necessarily, that was taking something away from me to be telling me all the time, "Oh, you don't look different at all. You just look white." And so I think I have been perceived as not other, but I'm now finding a lot more community with other people of color, both Japanese Americans, but also, I've found it really enriching to connect with my Black friends, my Indigenous friends, my Latino friends. And in fact, in my family, we've always been a little bit more Latino than Japanese. All of us speak Spanish. We've traveled a lot in Central and South America. Most of, the people in my immediate family have lived in Latin America. So they're interesting sort of ways that we have navigated otherness in our family. And now, especially since the shootings in Atlanta and with COVID and all the anti-Asian hate that's coming up in terms of the racialization of disease, at the same time that in my family, we're really like embracing our Japanese American heritage more and being more public about it. It's interesting to feel a little bit more isolated and othered in Wyoming than maybe my siblings and I felt growing up, if that makes any sense at all. Sort of a rambly answer.
Well, one of the things that's always fascinating about to me about your sign there, the "We're not foreign, we're from Wyoming," right? Is for one, it's such a Wyoming thing, right? Those of you who have not been to Wyoming, we have the buffalo or the bucking horse on everything. Next to Texas, we probably have the most state pride, and so it's not unusual to see that in any way. But on the other hand, my heart hurts a little bit when I see it because I'm like, oh, here's somebody who has to go out of the way to say they're not foreign, and to be able to express that Wyoming pride. And I think it's something that you see when you read about the Nisei reactions. a lot of people in their oral histories will talk about, we feel really accepted within this community and so forth and so on. And then they'll go on to talk about the racism they experienced, but then brush it aside and then go back to, but we feel really accepted. So I'm interested in your families. Do you have, stories like that? How did you process some of the, racism, discrimination that you may have encountered living in, what can be sometimes an environment where you stand out?
Well, I'd say it's pretty much all the time. And, it's, if you're a Jewish person and you go into a bar on St. Patrick's Day, you can belly up to the bar and no one thinks twice. I walk, I'm Mohashi, so I celebrate St. Patrick's Day. And so I walk into a bar on St. Patrick's Day and what are you doing here? And so it's, maybe it's just me. I walk into a Starbucks and, people look, what are you doing here? And it's just something that, that you get aware of. I really didn't get to feel who was saying that, Dan was saying something about not really noticing anything until he got older. Well, the same with me. I didn't get followed around the store until I was an adult in Boulder, Colorado, looking at stuff at Macy's and getting followed around. So I didn't really experience it all until I was older myself.
Well, folks, I think we are running low on time. I could sit here and pick your brains all night. But I definitely hope this is the beginning of many, many conversations. I think Alan said it best, when we start these conversations, when we start communicating, all of those photos and documents come out of the attic and we start to realize that there are vibrant communities where nobody thought that they were at the beginning. And so I want to thank you all for starting this conversation tonight. And I want to thank everybody who tuned in so much. It's been a wonderful panel, and Tadaima has been outstanding this year, and we're so happy to be a part of it. So thank you to all the organizers, Kamiko and everyone else who's worked so hard to make this event happen. Have a good night, everyone.